Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the launch of the 2021 State and Trends of Carbon Pricing Report. The report is a World Bank annual publication providing the latest developments in carbon pricing at the jurisdictional, sectoral, and corporate levels over the past year. I hope many of you already had a chance to listen to the opening I4C plenary session earlier today, where, among many interesting topics, the topic of carbon pricing was discussed. And we heard about the important role carbon pricing can play in setting market signals and as part of a set of policies and investments to drive economic transition to low and eventually net zero carbon emissions. Also discussed was the critical importance of taking into account the distributional effects of carbon pricing to ensure a just transition. So these discussions really highlight the need to keep track and report on the state and trends of carbon pricing around the world. You'll hear a lot more about it this morning, but just the quick headlines. The findings from the report show that despite the economic slowdown due to the pandemic, there were positive trends for carbon pricing in the past 12 months. The launch of China's national emissions trading system and updates to the European Union emissions trading system as part of the European Green Deal recovery package are some of the really breakthrough jurisdictional developments. There are 64 carbon pricing instruments, meaning carbon taxes or emission trading systems, now in operation, covering over 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. These systems generated $53 billion in revenue, which is a 17% increase from the previous year. And that is, I think, especially notable given the challenges faced around the world due to the COVID pandemic. But despite these positive developments, there's still a long way to go. In the majority of jurisdictions with carbon pricing in place, carbon prices remain far below the $40 to $80 per ton range that was recommended by the High-Level Commission for Carbon Pricing that's needed to meet the 2-degree temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. In a sobering reality, carbon prices of $40 or more cover less than 5% of global emissions. Supporting the design of ambitious carbon pricing policies that can facilitate a just transition is at the heart of work that our core team here at the Carbon Markets and Innovation Unit at the World Bank does. Our flagship technical assistance program on carbon pricing and carbon markets, the Partnership for Market Readiness, supported carbon pricing efforts in more than 20 countries and will come to an end now this June. The Partnership for Market Implementation, which is the successor program, will help countries implement carbon pricing as part of larger decarbonization framework and sustainable development framework. And that PMI is just being launched. So as countries start to begin the pandemic recovery process, there is an opportunity for inclusive, resilient, low carbon recovery. Carbon pricing can play a critical role in signaling the direction of economies and generating much needed revenue for economic recovery. And the State and Trends report this year shows that most carbon pricing instruments were largely resilient despite the economic downturn over the past year. So on behalf of the team, I want to thank the partners and staff who made the report possible and the panelists from the European Commission, Swiss Re, and Tsinghua University for participating in this launch. I look forward to the discussion, and back to you, Angela. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendy, and thank you too for your leadership through this process. The report this year was prepared with the support of Climate Focus, and I'd also like to acknowledge the support that we got from CDP, the Ecosystem Marketplace, and Sinocarbon, as well as a range of many other stakeholders who took their time to contribute with comments or participated within the review of the report. So to take us into the key messages from this year's report, I'd like to hand over to Marisa Santikarn. Marisa is a climate change specialist within the Carbon Markets and Innovation Unit. And together with me, she co-led this work, focusing very much on the technical aspects of the work. So over to you, Marisa.
So thank you, everyone. And I'd like to welcome you to the launch of the 2021 edition of the State and Trends report. Before I begin, I also wanted to say thank you to Climate Focus and the other institutions that we worked with to produce this report, as well as also thank you to the broader World Bank team for producing the report and providing a lot of much needed psychological support throughout the process. Together, we've also updated the carbon pricing dashboard, which is available online and also contains much more detailed information about the carbon taxes, emissions trading systems, and domestic crediting mechanisms that we cover in this year's report. And so the two big themes of this year's report is what impact did the economic and social upheaval of COVID-19 have on carbon pricing plans and policies? And in addition, given the proliferation of net zero targets that we've seen not only from governments and corporations, what sort of ramifications does that have for how we use carbon pricing? And also looking at whether or not the kind of carbon pricing instruments we see today, their role, their design, whether that is going to have to be adapted and changed in order to put us on the right trajectory to meet those net zero targets. And so if we look at carbon taxes and emissions trading systems, we can see some early positive signs. And over the past 12 months, a lot of action has been happening in the EU. And so I'm really glad today that we actually have Polona from the European Commission, who will be able to talk to us in much more detail about the performance of the emissions trading system over the past year, which reached all-time highs in terms of its price, breaking 55 euros over the past few weeks. And also following on from the announcement of their Green Deal, what kind of changes and plans the Commission is contemplating for the emissions trading system as a result of strengthened short and medium-term ambition in the bloc. We've also seen increasing carbon price trajectories in countries like Canada, Germany, and Ireland. And also in New Zealand, the recently passed Climate Change Act sets up a national framework for their climate change policies in order to reach their 2050 net zero target. And this also includes their national emissions trading system, which has also seen some changes over the past year, most notably with the introduction of a cap and auctioning to the system this year. Governments are also starting to rethink how they address both the need for climate ambition and increasing climate ambition on one hand, and also the need to maintain and protect domestic competitiveness, with a lot of conversations within and across governments this year about the possibility of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. The possibility of a CBAM, everyone's favorite 2021 acronym of the year in the carbon pricing world, is most advanced in the European Union. And Polona may be able to share more details on the Commission's ideas and research behind this and how it may fit into the EU emissions trading system. Finally, over the past 12 months, we've also seen a number of new carbon taxes and emissions trading systems come online. And so if we turn to look at everybody's favorite map, we can see that there are 64 carbon taxes and emissions trading systems in operation this year that together cover just over a fifth of global greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, the big news that has really dominated the carbon pricing space over this past year has been the launch of China's national emissions trading system, which started operation this year. Initially only covering the power sector, the national emissions trading system is the world's biggest carbon market and already regulates around 30% of China's emissions. And I'm really happy today that we have Professor Duan Maosheng on the panel from Tsinghua University, because he'll be able to share much more information on the rollout of the national carbon market, the plans for how this system may evolve in the future, and also how it fits in terms of China's broader climate and energy strategy. We've also seen a lot of action happening in Europe, with 2 new national carbon markets launching at the start of this year in Germany and the UK. Germany's national fuel emissions trading system starts with a fixed price of 25 euros and gradually increases to 55 euros by 2025. And it regulates those emissions that aren't already covered by the EU emissions trading system. In the UK, a lot of you have probably seen the news in the last few weeks that the new national ETS there has had its first auction, and with trades starting and prices reaching around $70 in the initial stages. The new national ETS replaces the country's participation in the EU ETS after it left the bloc this year, and the cap for this new national carbon market has been set in line with the country's net zero 2050 target. Apart from that, and also still in Europe, we have 2 new carbon taxes in Luxembourg and the Netherlands at about 30 euros, which complements those countries' participation in the EU ETS. I promise I will stop saying the word EU ETS so many times. And also in Mexico, we've seen a couple of new subnational carbon taxes come into operation. And there's a lot more detail on all of these developments and changes in both the dashboard and the status report this year. I also wanted to flag that we've had a couple of big announcements over the past year about potential new emissions trading systems that may be coming online. We had, for instance, an announcement from the minister in Ukraine that a national ETS is being planned to start in 2025. Over on the East Coast, plans for the Transportation and Climate Initiative program, which would regulate transport emissions on the East Coast in a manner similar to RGGI, has also progressed. And there's also been a trial emissions trading system in the power sector in Indonesia. And so if we look at the performance of carbon pricing over the past year, we've seen that despite COVID, actually most plans for carbon pricing, be it the rollout of new instruments, changes to the ambition or the scope, most of that has actually continued without any major delays, which is a really positive sign. In addition, prices were also largely unaffected, and the resiliency of carbon pricing instruments in a time of economic downturn, particularly in emissions trading systems, is a really positive sign. And so echoing findings that were also in the ICAP status report, although prices initially dipped in most emissions trading systems, they managed to stabilize. And this was likely aided by the existence of price or supply adjustment mechanisms in almost all emissions trading systems. And this really provides a market contrast with how emissions trading systems performed 15 years earlier with the Great Financial Crisis, where as a result of the economic recession, we really saw a sustained depression in allowance prices as a result. However, if you look at how carbon prices in general are as of 2021, we can see that there's still a really, really big range with prices under $1 all the way up to almost $140. Now, part of this diversity is, of course, going to be a result of the different roles that those carbon taxes or emissions trading systems play in different jurisdictions. It's going to reflect the stage of development, it's going to reflect different local circumstances, and it's also going to reflect the different roles that those carbon pricing instruments might play. So you can imagine, for instance, that you might see really different prices in an emissions trading system or carbon tax that is really playing that dominant primary role in a jurisdiction's mitigation strategy, as opposed to one that's maybe only focusing on a certain sector or is playing more of that backstop role. That being said, though, if you look at the carbon taxes and emissions trading systems in operation today, less than 5% of those are generating prices that are at or above the $40 to $80 range that was recommended by the World Bank's High-Level Commission on Carbon Pricing as to the price levels you need to see in 2020. And if we're going to have a chance of hitting the 1.5 degree target that's endorsed in the Paris Agreement, we're going to need to see even higher prices than this. And so despite these really positive signs that we've seen over the past year and the increasing number of carbon pricing instruments, short and medium term ambition still needs to be strengthened, and countries' climate plans continue to fall short of what's needed for the Paris Agreement, and carbon pricing instruments there are no exception. If we look at carbon crediting mechanisms, we sort of see a similar story in that despite the economic downturn over the past year, we're still continuing to see increased interest in crediting mechanisms, and we're seeing growth in not only the number of projects that are registered, but also the number of credits that are issued, with both of these numbers increasing about 10% if you compare 2019 to 2020. Of course, these annual numbers are still lower than the really historic highs we saw towards the end of the first compliance period of the Kyoto Protocol, but these are still quite positive signs. And so if you look at the graph here on cumulative issuance of credits, I practiced this and I still didn't get it right. You can see that the lion's share of the growth is really happening in those independent crediting mechanisms. And so these are standards like the gold standard and Vera, where they generate credits that are most often used to supply, that are used by corporates basically to meet a share of their voluntary climate commitments. We're also seeing a 25% increase in credits issued from domestic crediting mechanisms, and that's largely driven by issuances in Australia and California. If we look at crediting demand, the latest data that we have available here is from 2019. And what the data shows us is that the growth in demand for credits, which grew 6% if you compare 2018 to 2019 data, is largely being driven by the growth in voluntary climate commitments. And you can imagine potentially that once we get the data for 2020 and 2021, with increasing corporate commitments to net zero, we may also see a growth in crediting demand there as well. If you look at domestic carbon pricing instruments, we can see that demand there is present, but it remains limited compared to what you see in the voluntary market. Now, this is partly because a lot of those carbon taxes and emissions trading systems do have strict limits on the share of credits you can use for compliance, and also the type of credits you can use. But this source of demand may potentially grow as you see, for instance, Canada moving towards allowing credits to be used for their federal carbon pricing system, and also the use of credits potentially in China's national emissions trading system. Now, in terms of how crediting fits in this new net zero world that we're finding ourselves in, we have seen a lot of debate and discussions that not only have taken place in the carbon pricing space, but I would say in the climate and broader business community on the role that crediting can play in corporate net zero strategies, but also on the type of credits that you can use as well. And there's been increasing consensus this past year, largely led by initiatives like the Task Force on Voluntary Carbon Markets, that companies really do need to focus on reducing their own emissions as the primary goal. Carbon credits, where they're used, if at all, should really just play a supplementary role. And as a perennial issue to the use of carbon credits, that's a really important issue that not only governments and companies have to tackle as well, is looking at the issue of environmental integrity. And having systems in place to assess the environmental integrity of the credits that you're going to use as part of your net zero strategies is really important and remains a really important issue in the crediting landscape. Now, there has also been some discussion and some moves towards adopting minimum standards or looking at preferring different types of credits to one another. But the voluntary market is likely to remain heterogeneous for the next few years, and you will probably see continued demand for credits that may not meet those minimum standards continue. Finally, I just wanted to talk about internal carbon pricing, which builds on a lot of the data that is publicly submitted to the CDP. And here we find that nearly half of the world's largest 500 companies in terms of market cap use or intend to use an internal carbon price within the next 2 years. This is an increase of almost 20% compared to previous year's data. And most of the action here, most of the use of an internal carbon price is actually taking place within the energy sector. But in the past few years, we've really seen more and more companies in the financial sector adopt an internal carbon price. And so I'm also really happy that we have Patrick on the panel, because I think he knows much more about internal carbon pricing than I do. And I think he'll be able to give a really nice example of what Swiss Re is doing and how they've designed and used an internal carbon price as part of their broader climate strategy. And finally, there's also a growing correlation that we've seen not only between the use of an internal carbon price in companies and their existence in jurisdictions that are already regulated by a carbon price, but also with companies that have adopted a science-based target as well. So to conclude, I think the main messages really in this year's report are that, we are seeing some really early positive signs. We're seeing a lot of commitments now to net zero by companies and by governments, and they're starting to slowly adjust their carbon pricing design and climate policies in response to that. And despite the economic downturn over the past year, the resiliency of carbon pricing instruments throughout this, not only in terms of prices, but also their rollout and implementation, are really positive signs. But the potential for carbon pricing to do more still remains untapped and could be better geared to meet net zero targets. If we look at crediting, it's also a similar story in that we're seeing continued interest in the use of credits, but the role of these credits, and particularly the type and environmental integrity of these credits, remains a really important issue that needs to be addressed going forward. And now there are a bunch of other topics that are covered in the report, from political economy concerns to digital technology and the revenue generated by carbon pricing instruments. And so I really encourage everybody to have a look at the report. Please do not email me if you find any typos, because I cannot see straight anymore. And I really look forward to the panel discussion where we can delve into more of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marisa, for that very comprehensive presentation. I see questions already popping up in the chat box, but I'll come back to those after we've had a chance to listen to our guest panelists. So today we have three eminent guests with us. We have Polona Gregorin, who is the Deputy Head of Unit for the ETS Policy Development and Auctioning at the European Commission. We also have Professor Duan Maosheng, who's a Professor and Director of the China Carbon Market Center at Tsinghua University in China. And we also have Patrick Sanner, who's the Head of Macro Strategy at the Swiss Re Institute. I would like to invite the panelists to start off either with short presentations or interventions. And first out, I'd like to pass the floor over to you, Polona.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thank you for inviting the European Commission today to speak about, well, how the EU ETS or European carbon market has performed in the last year, as well as, what are our plans for the future. Let me briefly touch upon indeed the European carbon market's performance last year. As Wendy and Marisa have already both said, in general, I think we are happy to say that the carbon markets have performed very well, despite the COVID lockdown implications and impacts. And that very much applies to the European carbon market. In fact, we have seen the carbon price signal remain robust and reaching all-time highs. This is also, of course, consequence of the let's say, the interest in the European Green Deal and the follow-up on it. So, in terms of emission reductions, which of course is the main aim of the cap and trade systems, the emission reductions that were achieved in 2020 in the EU reached 13%. Needless to say, part of that is a consequence of COVID implications, but we should nevertheless we should not forget that the year before, so well before the COVID pandemic has hit, we have seen the emission reductions in the EU ETS reach almost 9%. So even before the pandemic has hit, we have seen substantial emission reductions due to the carbon price signal, notably in the power sector, where we see a lot of switching from coal to natural gas, as well as an increase in renewables. Now, if I turn to our plans for the future, as you know, the main the main strategy, guiding strategy that has been guiding our work in the last couple of years, and that will continue to guide it in the years to come, is the European Green Deal. As a first step following the European Green Deal, last year the European Commission came up with a plan to increase our 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction target from a current target of 40% to increase it to at least 55% reduction by 2030 compared to 1990. So as a consequence of this, now we're of course also in the process of revising all the instruments that we have in place to achieve those targets. And one of them, if not certainly a key one, is the EU emission trading system. So the next step will be that in July or by July, we, the European Commission, will come up with a proposal to revise the emission trading system. Now, the proposal or the work that is ongoing now, the analysis, focuses on two main aspects. One is the strengthening of the existing EU ETS. So in the EU, as you probably know, the emission trading so far applies to the power sector and the industry sector, as well as intra-EU aviation. So we know that if we are now, strengthening the overall emission reduction target, of course, the EU ETS needs to be strengthened as well, and its cap sort of strengthened or tightened proportionally. Now, the second aspect that we're currently working on is a possible extension of emission trading system. So a possible extension of carbon pricing at the EU level to also sectors that are currently not yet covered by the EU ETS, notably buildings and road transport. So this is very much ongoing work. When it comes to the possible extension to these new sectors, our current thinking is that if the Commission is to propose that, it would probably start as a separate system, so separate from the current ETS, because as experience with the current system has shown, we need to first put in place sort of a reliable and robust monitoring, reporting, and verification system. And for that, of course, it might be wise to start with a separate system. Then maybe also let me turn quickly to the other sectors. As I already mentioned, the EU ETS already covers also intra-EU aviation. And there the Commission has already been clear that in line with the EU's EU-wide commitment under the Paris Agreement, we will continue to cover at least the intra-EU aviation, but we will also include, again, at least intra-EU maritime transport into the EU ETS. And finally, as Marisa already also mentioned, in order to address possible risk of carbon leakage as the EU increases its target, we could also possibly propose a carbon border adjustment measure that could mitigate that risk. But of course, it's something that would need to be WTO compliant. So I'll stop at this. I hope this gives you a short overview of what we have in store for the next year, but I'm happy to get any questions from your end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Polona. I know 3 minutes is not long enough to fit in the wealth of information of what the EU is doing. I do see a number of questions coming through. We will come back to them, I promise. So we'll move straight on to Professor Duan to give us some insights on the Chinese national ETS and how this will interact with other policies, among other issues. So Professor Duan, you have the floor now.
Yes, thank you, Angela. It's very nice to join this event. I have 2 slides, one on the status quo of the near future plan of China's national emission trading system, and another on the outlook of the future possible revision. I mean, the first compliance of the China's national emission trading system has already started, and the actual transaction is expected to happen in next month. I think the delay is mainly caused by the preparation of the technical systems. So they are now at the final stage of testing use of the registry and the trading system. And also the ETS authority asked the power companies that are covered by the system to report their emissions for year 2020 by the end of April. And for the other companies, they need to report their emissions by the end of September. And the provinces are responsible for the verification of the reported data, and they are asked to finish the verification by the end of June for the power sector, and by the end of the year for the other sectors. And because in China's national emission trading system, we are using the real output for free allocation. So I mean, we can only know the actual allowances to be allocated for a company when we know their real output. So basically, so the adjustment of the allocation will be finished by the end of September. And for the companies, they are asked to surrender allowances for the emissions of the previous 2 years by the end of this year. So basically, the end of this year, they need to surrender emission allowances for the previous year's 2 emissions, and also the provinces are asked to determine the list for power companies to be included in the system by the end of June. I mean, this is for year 2021. And now we have some basic rules for the national system, but the financial penalty for non-compliance is very, very limited. I think from 1,500 US dollar to basically around $3,000 US dollar. But I mean, we are not only using financial penalty for promoting compliance, and we're also using many other rules. And I mean, that's why we are the authority is working very hard to have a state council regulation, because currently what we have as a legal basis for the national system is a ministry decree, so it's limited. So the legal status is rather low in the Chinese legal system. And for this year, I think maybe we will not see auction, but I mean, I think there's a possibility that we will see auction, but I think this will happen only if the market liquidity, there are some problems in market liquidity that cannot help companies to fulfill their compliance purpose. I think that's and before our national system, we have 8 regional systems, and all of them are covering the power sector. So once the power company is covered by the national system, it will no longer be covered by the national system. So this is a current status, and also a very near future plan for the national system. And then very quick outlook on the future development. First, I mean, we will say more sectors to be included in our national system. I think maybe we will start from the building material and the non-ferrous metal. I mean, we have done some work in the past, and also we will need to make our system design more adaptable to our new carbon peaking and also carbon neutrality target. And I think first on the cap, currently the emission cap for our national system is basically an intensity-based one. So we don't have a predetermined absolute cap. But I think with the newly announced carbon peaking target, I think we need to transition from an intensity-based cap to an absolute cap very quickly. I mean, if the covered sectors already have, because for most of the emissions intensive sectors, they are now developing their own carbon emissions peaking plan. I mean, if they have already their own peaking plan, I mean, why don't we have an absolute cap for them? And I think that's a very simple logical issue. And also we will say phasing in our auctions for allowances, and then a corresponding issue is how we are going to use the auction revenues. In the proposed state council regulation, it is I think they propose that we are going to have a emissions trading fund. I mean, there are also many other proposals, low carbon development fund. I mean, whatever. Well, I mean, we need to consider how to use the auction revenue. Another issue is how we can manage or intervene the market. I mean, if needed, I think according to the ETS authority, they will have in place some market stability measures. But I mean, that's just concepts. We need to see how they will translate those concepts into real measures. So Angela, I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Duan. I think the Chinese ETS is one that was long awaited, and we are very encouraged to see that it is now operational. We've heard a lot from what governments do, and as Marisa indicated in the report, the last year did also see significant progress from the private sector. So now I'd like to turn to Patrick Sane from Swiss Re to give us some insights on Swiss Re's work using the internal carbon price, especially since the very ambitious announcement that was made last year to increase the internal carbon price to $100 and work to ratchet this up even further. So, Patrick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you. It's a pleasure to speak on this occasion. I see. Thank you, Marissa, for having shared or sharing the slides. So sustainability is at the core of what we do at Swiss Re, and I'm happy to share a few insights around how we look at sustainability and carbon pricing overall. So actually on slide 2, to make progress around carbon emissions, institutions need to recognize that sustainability matters. And we view sustainability as a value driver, and we embrace it as such. So our approach to carbon emission reduction is do our best and remove the rest. So we do our best to reduce carbon emissions in the first place. And for the rest, we buy carbon offsets and eventually carbon removal certificates. And as you see on this slide, we have continuously set sustainability and carbon emission targets over the past 2 decades. And the results are really something we're proud of. We have achieved a total reduction of CO2 emissions per employee of 80% since 2003. But it doesn't stop there. We also do ESG assessments with the vendors that we engage with, and we monitor the carbon intensity of our assets and some underwriting portfolios as well. And in fact, for the asset side, we have managed to reduce the carbon intensity of our corporate bond and listed equity portfolio by 50% over the past 5 years. So we have started our sustainability journey several decades ago, and this year also introduced a higher internal carbon steering levy, which you see on the next slide. So we are the first multinational company that has introduced a triple digit carbon levy on direct and indirect operational emissions. It's $100 per ton of CO2 emissions, and this number is based on the call by the UN Global Compact, of which we are a member. Marissa, if you could go to the next slide, you see exactly. So here you see an overview of how we're approaching it. So as mentioned, $100 per ton of CO2 emissions as of this year. We will gradually increase this price to $200 by 2030, which is the estimated cost of high quality carbon removal solutions by then. Now, how is it applied? It's basically applied in 2 steps. So first, we show the levy at all times and across all hierarchy levels. So from an operational point of view, our biggest share of operational emissions comes from business travel. So that CO2 levy is shown on all business travel that Swiss Re employees do, and this in itself incentivizes emission reduction. But second, the funds that are obtained by this levy will also help us purchase high quality removal certificates as the journey progresses. So where is the journey going? So as you saw on the previous slide, we have cut emissions by employees by roughly 80% since 2003. But now we also developed a spending plan for emission compensation and a roadmap on the carbon compensation mix until 2030. So the end goal is that we achieve net zero in our own operations by 2030 and across the entire business, including asset and the underwriting side by 2050. Now on the final slide, on slide 4, you see we have achieved a lot already over the past decades, and it continues to be a learning journey. That's clear. The carbon pricing that we have complements other reduction efforts that we undertake, and we're very transparent on our approaches and also share our learnings in publications and also on our website at swissre.com if anyone would like to take a look. But I would say that governments and companies need to recognize that the time to act is really now, since the current country emission commitments are far short of the reductions that are needed to achieve the Paris Agreement. So we hope that this forum and the new World Bank report can be a positive catalyst in the right direction. So let me stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for that. It is indeed very encouraging, and I really liked your motto, do your best and remove the rest, which clearly shows that decarbonization first and removals as a complement to that. So I will now turn to, we've received a number of questions that I want to put to to you all. And also a reminder to the audience, if you have any burning questions, please put them in the chat so that we could try to get to them. So I will start maybe with the first question to Bologna, and this relates to how the EU is thinking on the use of Article 6 to reach its NDC targets. Maybe if you can give us some insights, especially also on how you will see the role of the voluntary market in this regard. Over to you, Polona.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. In short, the EU reduction target is a domestic one. The target for 2030 is a domestic one, so it does not foresee any use of international credits to achieve that target. When it comes to using, let's say, voluntary offset or offsets of any kind, we do envisage that, of course, in the long term, we will need to offset residual emissions with equivalent removals to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. But we are cautious about endorsing offsetting as a mechanism to deliver on the commitments at present, because, well, I think as we just heard from Patrick, use of offsetting is, of course, not a substitute for the significant emission reductions that are needed in pretty much all sectors of the economy to reach climate neutrality. And of course, there are also some concerns as to the quality and suitability of the offsets available, as many of them were designed before we had climate neutrality as a policy goal, and before many other countries outside the EU had mitigation targets, as they exist now under the NDCs, under the Paris Agreement. So in short, yeah, the EU reduction target remains a domestic one, not foreseeing any use of international credits to achieve it.
So maybe I could turn to Duan, actually in a similar vein. Does the Chinese ETS foresee the use of voluntary credits? And also, I think there is a question here relating to the two China carbon platforms that are eligible under ICAO and ICAO's CORSIA program. And how do you see how these two platforms relate to the federal or to the national Chinese ETS system?
Yeah, I think for the for China's national emission trading system, we are allowing the use of offsets. So basically, I think currently we only allow the emission reduction credits from our national voluntary verified system. So it's a system very similar to the CDM, and that system is eligible under the CORSIA. And I'm not very clear about what's the second one eligible, the second Chinese one eligible under the CORSIA. I mean, I'm not very clear about that.
Thanks. I think the question was whether those two Chinese platforms that do engage in the voluntary carbon, that operate with voluntary carbon credits would engage in the ETS. So I would assume, as you say, if voluntary credits are, or if offsets are allowed, would there be scope for them to also engage? I'll move on to the next question, because I think the question of offsets, the EU has already indicated the concern around quality, and this being, of course, one of the considerations in keeping this aside. And maybe to Swiss Re, to Patrick, as this is actually a perennial question that keeps coming up when looking at are offsets of a high quality, do they, meet the demands around permanence, are they quantifiable, and so on? How are you dealing with this, especially in the short term, when considering carbon removal quality, or the credit of carbon removal credits as part of your climate strategy? I know you did talk about raising the price to a higher level, which would be commensurate to higher quality, but how are you relating to this in the short and medium term?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a couple of things. So for 2021, we are targeting 10% of carbon removal, with 90% being carbon offsets. But as you mentioned, I mean, the fact is that a lot of the carbon removal technology is still in its infancy. So, you know, we are entering long-term strategic agreements. We contribute to carbon removal funds. We have partnerships. Sometimes we do over-the-counter approaches for carbon certificates. But unfortunately, there is no silver bullet in a sense, right? So, I mean, obviously, there are the natural-based solutions such as forestation, which you can already use. It's relatively cheap, but it's not permanent. If you then look at direct air carbon capture and storage, for example, there it becomes permanent, but the technology is just not quite there yet. So that is something that we're eyeing in the longer term. So that's also why we are approaching it through a phased-in approach. So we take step by step and see how we can best engage and catalyze, basically, and reflect that in our compensation mix.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question here about the role of speculators, and it reads that given that the ETSs can open up participation to entities that do not have compliance obligations, how can this possibly impact the price signal within the different jurisdictions beyond what is affordable to the industry? I think as one person has indicated, for example, as we saw during the COVID-19 downturn. So maybe I could start with you, Polona, on this and then move to Professor Duan.
Sure. So in the EU ETS, indeed, we do allow participation of entities other than just the obligated entities with surrender obligations, so the industry and the power sector currently. The financial intermediaries have been part of the EU carbon market since its start. We believe they play an important role in providing liquidity to the market and also to help compliance buyers with their hedging needs, to hedge for future price risk by providing future contracts and things like that. In particular, we find they're very important for providing liquidity, because if you can imagine, what is worse for volatility is, of course, illiquid market. That will be something that really leads to volatility. So without the presence of these participants in the market, that could be a risk. But of course, we have, let's say, rules or market oversight framework in place, which is similar or actually the same that applies to other financial markets. With robust reporting and transparency requirements, which allowed competent authorities in the countries, in EU member states, to monitor the trading behavior of different categories of market participants, which also, of course, includes financial entities. So far, our experience with this framework is that it works well. When it comes to, let's say, the impact or maybe the resilience of the, at least EU carbon price, during the COVID, what we can say is, of course, that the EU ETS is by now, 15 years running a mature market that not only reflects the current supply and demand in allowances, but it's also a forward-looking market reacting to political decisions that affect, of course, the possible future supply and demand for allowances in the system. So we have observed that the market has reacted, of course, to the announced changes to our climate ambition, which of course will translate to, let's say, tightened caps, so lower supply of allowances. And that is what, of course, also is reflected in the carbon price signal. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and I know we still have a number of questions. I just want to assure you that we do continue these dialogues through the year. We will have several opportunities to delve into much more depth into this subject. Please visit our website to read the report. Visit the carbon pricing dashboard, which is also regularly updated with new developments. And we will be also releasing the State and Trends of 2021 in Chinese and Spanish. just to make sure that it is fully accessible. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our panelists for taking the time to join us, to thank all of you who have taken the time to come here and listen to this launch, and to the team for the preparation of the report. So thank you very much, and the event is over.